Dr. Susan Hawthorne is a writer, researcher, publisher, occasional academic, and the convener of the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, COAL. She joined the women's liberation movement in 1973 and for several years was a volunteer at Melbourne's Rape Crisis Centre. She has been doing research on lesbians who have been tortured and lesbian refugees. And now I'd like to hand over to Susan. Susan Hawthorne, take it away.
My talk today is called Asking Questions About Lesbians, and it was given last week at the forum in New York, online, but the online version. Never mind, we get a chance to do it again. So today I'm speaking to you from Juru country in far north Queensland, where I live and work, and I respectfully acknowledge their custodianship of the land's waterways. I also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. I'm beginning my talk today with some quotations from lesbians who've been subjected to violence, including corrective rape, torture, forced pregnancy and forced marriage, imprisonment, and the ultimate punishment, murder. I honour all these lesbians for their strength, for their resistance, and for their love for lesbians, and I raise questions on behalf of them and all lesbians. So the research that this is based on is what I've been doing since 2003, and you can read more about it in Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, and also I took from last year, Lesbian Politics, Culture, Existence, which is a whole stack of essays written over 50 years. So now to the words of lesbians. In Sierra Leone, on 29 September 2004, Fanny Ann Eddy was found dead after being repeatedly raped. She had testified at the UN Commission on Human Rights in 2004, just a few months before her death. She wrote, "Silence creates vulnerability. You, members of the Commission on Human Rights, can break the silence. You can acknowledge that we exist throughout Africa and on every continent, and that human rights violations based on sexual orientation or gender identity are committed every day. You can help us combat those violations and achieve our full rights and freedoms in every society, including my beloved Sierra Leone." She had been working in the offices of the Sierra Leone Lesbian and Gay Association, which she founded, on the day that she was murdered. My questions are, what action was taken by the UN Commission of Human Rights then, and what action is being taken now? Human rights commissions seem to have a very bad record. I ask, would we try to be horrified about what has happened to lesbians? In 1976, under the Pinochet regime in Chile, Consuelo Rivera Fuentes was tortured and later fled to England as a refugee. She writes in a co-authored piece with her partner in 2001, she writes this: "No training session prepared me for this intense pain, my pain, the one I did not choose. All this alienation, this empty vacuum, my body, my mind, my pain. This is not happening. I am a little speck in the universe. Which universe? The world is not anymore. I am disintegrating, bit by bit, yell by yell, electrode by electrode. The pain, all this pain here and there, down there in my vagina, the agony. Where am I? Where is my I?" Consuelo asks, where is my I, after her experience of torture? She is also asking, where is my lesbian I? Where is the centrality of the experiences of lesbians recorded and recognised? Where is the recognition that the violation of lesbians goes on day after day and no one speaks of it. An unnamed lesbian refugee from Iran says of her experience in Kashan, they tied me to a car and pulled me across the ground. What should I say? Who should I say it to? Why doesn't anyone listen to us? Where is this human rights? An unnamed Peruvian lesbian says, when I speak of my right to my own culture and language as an Indigenous woman, everyone agrees to my self-determination. But when I speak of my other identity, my lesbian identity, my right to love, to determine my own sexuality, no one wants to listen. In Zimbabwe, in the mid-1980s, Tina Machida says, they locked me in a room and brought him every day to rape me, so I would fall pregnant and force me to marry him. They did this to me until I was pregnant. In my book Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, I also document the murders of lesbians in South Africa, yet sexual orientation is a protected characteristic in the South African Constitution, as well as murders of lesbians in the US, including the murders of 2 lesbians and their son by transgender advocate Dana Rivers in 2016. So what are the elements that go together to make it so difficult to have successful campaigns on behalf of lesbians? So this is a list of features that I've noticed. When colonisers conquer a land, their first reports back to empire usually contain something along the lines of, the natives possess no culture. They excuse themselves for conquering and dispossessing others. In the same way, lesbians are said to have no culture. The denial of lesbian existence, which is a way of breaking the spirit. The destruction of lesbian knowledge and culture. Heterosexuality is imposed. Isolation, a particular problem for young lesbians, lesbians with a disability, and old lesbians. There's also the criminalisation of lesbians, punishment, including the death penalty, long imprisonment, and torture, including rape, and humiliating sexual violence, and things like being pushed off the top of buildings till their death. Murder, honour killings, and persistent rape, so the lesbian becomes pregnant against her will, and corrective rape by gangs of young men, prison guards, and families. Treatment as second-class citizens, direct or indirect discrimination. Government failure to recognise lesbians in law as a distinct group subjected to discrimination. Inferior medical services, such as partners not recognised as next of kin. If a lesbian manages to bring a case against the perpetrator, there is a high chance she'll be forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement. This results in the crime being made invisible as a crime against a lesbian, and in that way, it doesn't exist. Lesbians are shamed and expected to be either heterosexual or, if not, to transition and appear as masculine. Shame creates isolation. Ostracism can result in bullying, taunts, and beatings. It creates what Indian writer Maya Sharma calls a discourse of catastrophe. Lesbians are also declared mad. Lesbians who resist publicly are attacked both online and in real life. If a lesbian becomes famous, she'll be remembered either for her sexuality, in which case her achievements remain hidden, or her sexuality will be hidden and her achievements remembered. These are the result of shame and make documenting lesbian history very difficult. Reading through that, it makes me realise it's amazing we keep going. Is it any wonder then that lesbians that lesbian refugees have to travel such a hard path gaining refugee status. In 1987, 11 years after she'd been released from prison and Chile was apparently now under democratic rule, a trap was set for Consuelo Rivera Fuentes, who I talked about earlier. A policeman came to her workplace at the British Commissariat and told her she should come to police headquarters with him after convincing her she had nothing to fear. He took her through the building where she had been tortured and into a room where an officer sat at a table. The officer wanted her to have sex with his female lover. Consuelo realised this was a trap and she agreed to meet him in 2 weeks. Consuelo left Chile 5 days later. She had already planned to fly to the UK and was enrolled in a women's studies course there. It just shows how important women's studies is, and everything important. Nigerian activist Aderonke Apata was not so lucky. It took her 13 years to gain asylum in the UK. One of the sticking points, according to Theresa May, who headed the Home Office at the time, was that Aderonke was pretending to be a lesbian to gain asylum. She was put in solitary confinement for a week in Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre in 2012. The accusation of pretense was because she was the mother of a child, and the assumption was, therefore, she must be heterosexual. As we know, there are many lesbians who are mothers, some who've married because this was a temporary protection for them. Likewise, if a lesbian does not have a current female partner, the question is raised, is she really a lesbian? A lesbian without a female partner slips to the default position of heterosexual. In the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, lesbians are put in Block 13, which is reserved for LGBT people, a group that is not necessarily safe for lesbians. Lesbians are routinely abused and suffer persecution within the camp. This resembles what happens to lesbians who are in prison. Christine, a Ugandan lesbian, was not only tortured by the guards, but raped by other prisoners. So when we come to Australia, a lesbian refugee wanting to gain asylum in Australia faces a difficult path. There are an enormous number of hurdles, among them endless documentation of the abuse and trauma a lesbian has suffered at the hands of family, community, religious groups, police and government. Some governments do not have an arm's length distance between those assessing the claims for refugee status and those enforcing the criminal laws against lesbians. The result is that lesbian claimants are vulnerable to punishment in the country from which they are attempting to escape. With a drawn-out bureaucratic system in the country to which she wants to move, her very existence is under constant threat. The legal costs of engaging an immigration lawyer are substantial, thousands of dollars, and each applicant needs letters of support that confirm the importance of this applicant's need for asylum. The word lesbian is not mentioned once by the Australian government in its recent 9th periodic report to CEDAW of January 2025. If the meaningless word gender identity is used, how can lesbians with a woman-to-woman sexual orientation be protected under law or gain entry into Australia when seeking asylum as lesbian refugees? Members of the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, that's COAL, a tiny unfunded organisation, are currently engaged in trying to assist 2 lesbians wanting asylum in Australia. We are told that the waiting period is likely 6 years before a decision is made. Guidelines for officials interviewing lesbian refugees. Some women might be persecuted because of their association with or under threat but if they're lesbians, their level of risk may be increased. It should not be assumed that a married woman cannot be a lesbian. In some countries, marriage is the first level of protection a lesbian might seek. Lesbians seeking asylum are likely to be politically active, but even lesbians who are not politically active come under threat in some countries. Do not assume that because a woman does not use the word lesbian to describe herself, that she is not a lesbian. It may have been too dangerous for too long for her to be able to speak the word lesbian or the equivalent in her language out loud. Or the word may be so insulting in her own language that she does not want to use it. Do not assume that because there is no word for lesbian in any particular language, that there are therefore no lesbians in that society or linguistic group. Do not assume that if a woman comes from a country where it's not illegal to be a lesbian, that she is therefore not able to claim having been tortured or in danger of torture or other external harm to herself. Do not assume that your interpreter is open to her experience. The interpreter may be hostile to her claim. Lesbians who've been tortured will find it difficult to speak of their experience. Speaking to a stranger is difficult. Speaking to a strange man might be impossible. Uniformed men may precipitate reliving the experience of torture. As a result of torture, some lesbians may be unable to relate the experience at all, or might appear detached and emotionless. This should not be read as evidence of fabrication. Lesbians who are refugees might also be in danger from their families, in particular from the men in her families. Her confidential interview should not be shared by asking questions about her sexual orientation of other family members. So, in conclusion, if violence against lesbians is a matter of indifference and lesbians remain outside the scope of social justice reform, then everyone's civil and political rights remain in jeopardy. The most difficult political reforms to make are, in the long run, the most important because they give us a clue as to the limits of our preparedness to live an ethical existence. If we are unable to be concerned for the lives and well-being of those who are most different, then we're incapable of defending justice for all, even at the most basic level, that involving freedom of association and freedom to love. I would suggest that when lesbians become victims of attack, they are a signal. They are the canaries in the mine. And if the perpetrators get away with it, then other attacks will follow. So we need to be protesting every attack on lesbians because this is a sign of hatred in the social system. If lesbians are not protected, then people who don't fit some other social dimension will not be safe from attack either. Keep your lesbian sister safe and watch the effect it has on society. And these are all the various references that I've referred to in my talk. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody in the Coalition of Activist Lesbians for their responses and suggestions to this presentation. And that includes Vivian Morrigan and Deborah Staines and Barbara Clark, who all had suggestions. And my other co-presenters at last week's session, Sam Paul and Jan Rivers of Lava and Anna of Feminist Legal Union. And I'd also like to say thank you to Consuelo Rivera Fuentes for friendship and to lesbians facing the bureaucratic hurdles of seeking asylum. Sadly, Consuelo died a few years back. Thanks to lesbians around the world who continue to resist the horrors of violence and to fight for those whose lives have been directly affected by violence. So thank you, everybody. for coming today.
Thank you, Susan. A difficult, sobering listen, but so important. So thank you very much for bringing that to us.